Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Colin Jones, president of City Club. For more than a century, City Club is where civic-minded people have come together to find solutions to our region's biggest challenges. We're gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel and are joined by thousands of people via X-Ray.FM and its radio stations at 107.1 and 91.1 FM, KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app, and Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for all of the work they do to bring Friday Forum to our community. In addition to City Club's valuable media partners, our volunteers and staff enable us to put on the best civic programs week after week. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. Today we're discussing the challenges queer and trans people face when trying to participate in their religious communities. Joining us today are Reverend Dr. Brett Webb-Mitchell, the LGBTQ+ advocacy coordinator for the United Methodist Church's Oregon-Idaho Conference, and the organizing pastor at Community of Pilgrims Presbyterian Fellowship. He's one of only 2 openly gay Presbyterian pastors in Oregon, and the author of 10 books on a range of subjects, including Christian spirituality and growth, pilgrimages, and what it means to be a gay parent. Prior to joining the Oregon-Idaho Conference, he was on the faculty at Duke Divinity School and North Carolina Central University. Rabbi Deborah Kolodny, the spiritual leader of Portland's Unshul and a consultant who is helping to build advocacy coalitions, teaching workshops on interrupting hate in public spaces, and supporting labor management partnerships. She has decades of experience in interfaith social justice organizing as a leader of national retreat and advocacy organizations for LGBTQ Jews. She is the editor of the first anthology of bisexual people of faith and is a facilitator of the National Religious Leadership Roundtable at the LGBTQ Task Force. Moderating our discussion today is Carol Collymore, the Senior Manager of Community Impact at Nike, Secretary of the Cascade AIDS Project Board of Directors, and the former Executive Director of the Equity Foundation. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Hi, everyone. In Oregon, we are fortunate to live in a state that has more legal protections and supports for LGBTQ people than almost any other. From housing and healthcare to employment and a huge range of other issues, the hard and focused work of activists over the last 30 years has secured a lot of victories for LGBTQ Oregonians. But we also know that policy and legal wins are not the full story. Daily experiences and sometimes struggles in neighborhoods, families, teams, and communities can have as much of an impact on someone's well-being and happiness as any law written in Salem. So I'm grateful today to both of you for joining us to drill down those daily experiences. The goal of today's program isn't to debate state policies or even Supreme Court cases, as much as I really want to, but to develop a better understanding of the experience of being an LGBTQ person of faith and how that's changing. And the last thing I want to say before we dig into communities nor LGBTQ communities are monoliths. So I know you'll both speak from your own experiences, but I hope that if you've built partnerships or worked alongside faith leaders of color or Muslim community or trans people of faith, that you'll feel comfortable sharing those experiences and perspectives as they come up. So Brett and Deborah, here we go. I'm allowed to call them that I asked first. So to get started, I'm thinking it would be good to hear about your personal experiences. On Tuesday at Civic Drinks, a couple folks shared their coming out stories, and I'd love to ask the same of you. Could you both share a couple-minute story of what it was like to come out, particularly in the context of your faith and community? And Deborah, we can start with you.
Sure. Well, I guess I want to start by saying that I was raised by secular parents, and so I did not experience in my upbringing any of the religious wounding that many of my contemporaries did. There was no idea that Scripture had anything to say about being LGBTQ. So my coming out was very secular, and it was very easy. I was in college and I was playing rugby, and how cliched, right? Oh my gosh, all those strong women, and I was already radicalized politically. I was a radical feminist. I had very left politics, came from a family, unionist family, socialist leanings, and so when I became aware of my attraction to women, it was pretty much a non-thing for me. I was like, oh, cool. All right, where's the bar? How do I meet people outside of the rugby team? And yeah, it was a time, I was, I guess, 18 when I started becoming aware of my feelings. And yeah, I felt really, really well supported in my social circle. I didn't tell my parents right away. My mom freaked out. My dad was great. It was a couple years into my being with women, and I came out to him and he said, "Deborah, you're riding motorcycles and playing rugby. What do you think I thought?" He was so cool. So
How did your mom come around, though? How did she finally come around?
Oh my gosh, she was horrified. I think she had some experience herself. She also identified as a feminist, and she had gone back to college later in life. And she had some experiences with some really angry lesbians at college. And so I think she was terrified that I would become an angry lesbian. And so she was terrified about what it would do to our relationship. And she also did think it was unnatural and abnormal and that she had done something wrong. So it took actually quite a while. But I mean, over time, I think the culture at large changed. There were more and more role models in culture and political work of folks who were LGBTQ, and I think it became more normalized, I suppose. So I don't know that there was anything I said or did. But I will say that when I came out as bisexual a few years after I came out as lesbian, she was totally flipped out. She was like, "Deb, I'm so confused." And I said, "I'm so glad you know that you're confused, because I'm really clear. Like, I'm attracted to people based on their heart and their soul. And, you know, whether they have an innie or an outie isn't really the issue."
Thank you for sharing that. And Brad, can you share yours?
Sure. I was, unlike Deborah, I was raised in a religious home. I am a cradle Christian. At the tender age of infancy, of course, baptized in the Congregational Church, and then at the age of 13, I was confirmed at First United Methodist Church here in Portland. And but along the way, between that birth and then 13 years of being confirmed, I was already aware, I think around the age of 8 or 9, that I was attracted to other boys my age, that there was an undeniable desire within me just to hang out with other young guys. And yet I had no name to put to it. I had no understanding of what that was all about. And so feeling also a call and liking being around churches because they were places where I could be creative and I was musical and I could take my acting talents there and really enjoyed youth groups. I kind of dove, and I was being raised at that time between the ages of 12 and 18 here in Portland. I went into Young Life, I went to Malibu Club, I went to a conservative Presbyterian church youth group, and everything that I was being told at that time was, it's okay to be dating women, but no one is allowed to be gay. Or as the clinical term that was bandied about at that point was to be a homosexual. And so I was taught early on in life by the churches, Methodist, Presbyterian alike, that it was not good to be a homosexual, that the last thing I wanted to do was to be a homosexual. And so not seeing any role models that were really inviting, I was surrounded by Liberace on Mike Douglas' show, watching it with my grandmother, Charles Nelson Riley, Dom DeLuise, and Paul Lynn on the Center Square on Hollywood Squares. Seeing that those were the only options that I had and not seeing and being able to identify with any of them, I thought, I don't want to be a homosexual. I really don't want to be a homosexual, and therefore I went clearly into a gay closet and did everything in my power to be sure that I was not going to ever be categorized as being a homosexual. And so I married my dearest friend here in Portland, Oregon, and off I went on a road, on a path of seminary education, doing an MDiv, becoming an ordained clergy person in 1983. I've been ordained now almost 35 years. And the message at Princeton, the message at Harvard, the message at Duke, the message at Carolina where I went and did my MDiv, did all my degree work, kept on saying, it is not good for you to be gay. It is not good. The Bible makes it very clear, and the people I hung out with and the system that I was being rewarded by were clearly against people who are homosexuals. And so in the depth of my own oncoming depression, there was a biblical verse from Psalm 139 that kept on speaking to me. For you created my inmost being. This is the psalmist talking to God. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. So I realized around the age of 40 that I was not fooling God at all. That this God who had created me beautifully and without any hesitancy, he already knew, she already knew, God already knew that I was gay. And I guess part of my fear was on that great day in which there's that closer encounter beyond the darkness, that God would ask me, well, why did you doubt I made you who you were? Why did you live in that closet all that time? And so at around the age of 40, working for a United Methodist Church seminary, ordained as a Presbyterian clergy person, and again, in both the United Methodist Church at that time and in the Presbyterian Church USA at that time, neither of them were welcoming of LGBTQ people. Indeed, what I knew that I would what would happen to me is a church court. And that's kind of what I was waiting for. But again, it was undeniable to me that I was gay. So, unlike Deborah, my mom and dad were shocked. My former wife was shocked. And I then had 2 kids who were also at the age of 3 and 7, not knowing what the heck was going on. And so I went through that pretty much prototypical discovery of coming out. And coming out into a hostile environment in which I knew that I could be censured, I could be defrocked, but knowing that living in the closet was not working for me anymore, and to stay in the closet meant death, and that to live outside of the closet, to live honestly, openly, smart, meant life. And so that's the way. That's how I got to where I am today.
Great. For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Carol Collymore, and I'm talking with Rabbi Deborah Kolodny and Reverend Brett Webb Mitchell about LGBTQ experiences in the faith communities. Thank you both for sharing those stories. And I have to say, Dom DeLuise, like you just turned all my brains on. I remember watching him as a kid and being like, he's so interesting.
Right, I think he was straight, but golly day.
So, you know, it's 2018, and it seems kids are coming out earlier and earlier, which is really refreshing. It's glad they feel like they can come out in a safe space. Do you think, in either of your spaces, that young people are having a different experience within the faith community? Deborah, please.
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that there are hundreds of welcoming congregations in the Protestant world and in the Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, and Renewal worlds, which is about 80% of the Jewish world. We are welcoming and affirming. And I would also say that as early as the 1960s in the Jewish Renewal world, which is where I locate myself, it's the newest movement in Judaism, formed out of the alignment between kind of hippie, multi-religious engagement, Jews who had left Judaism and started hanging out in Buddhist satsangs and in yoga studios and at ashrams, intersecting with deeply mystical, traditional, like orthodoxy. There was never even a conversation about whether LGBTQ Jews would be welcome or would be ordained or same-sex people would be married. It was always an assumption that there would be full welcome inclusion and privilege in terms of access to roles and to the what Christians call the sacraments, but I would say rituals, right? So even as early as when I was born, there was a place where LGBTQ youth could be totally safe, but it was not the norm. So today we see that there are, over 50 years of evolution of consciousness in religious worlds. I speak about this frequently, so I have this chronology, and I'll tell you that the first openly gay rabbi was ordained in 1960, and the MCC denomination, which is an LGBTQ denomination in Christianity, although it's, I think, broader, it welcomes all, was founded in 1968. The Unitarian Association ordained their first gay minister in 1971. The UCC denomination ordained their first gay minister in 1972. And in 1997, Al-Fatiha, which is the first Muslim LGBTQ group, was formed. So that's, kind of the chronology of the beginnings. And since that time, there's been just a radical awakening, I would say, across the board. And, of course, there's still extremely conservative and negative and hostile and cruel and wounding traditions, but across the board in every religion. So yes, it is very different. What I see right now in my community, we probably have 1/2 to 3/4 of our members are LGBTQ, lots of trans men for whatever reason, and several genderqueer members, and several who have teenage kids who are queer, genderqueer, trans. And of course, having a queer-identified clergy creates an extraordinary degree of welcoming. Like, it's one thing to be able to unpack and the scriptures and say that's what you thought it meant is not what it meant. And it's another thing to be living an openly queer and incredibly happy and fulfilled and healthy life in a deep relationship with God and with spiritual community. So for people to see that as possible has changed the game totally.
I think that there has been a great and rapid evolution in terms of especially young people, and how it's had an effect not only in churches, mosques, and synagogues and temples, but also within society itself. I think what spurred and has spurred much of the change, in fact, within the context of many Protestant churches, was the gay-straight alliances that started to pop up in middle schools and high schools and things like that, in which there were these alliances being built between LGBTQ kids and allies in middle school and high school, and therefore coming into and looking at their faith communities and asking, where is that within these faith communities? Where can I hang out and be safe? Shouldn't my church, my mosque, my synagogue, my temple, shouldn't that be a safe place as well? When I taught at both Duke as well as North Carolina Central University, we had training going on in safe zone training. This is something that I've not seen replicated within any of the denominations yet, is safe zone training. And what it was, simply was this, is certain professors, staff, and administrators would be trained in how to create in their office space, in their place of employment, in their conversations, a safe place so that college students and university students and faculty and staff and administrators would feel safe. So I think what happened was, with all of these things happening outside of our faith communities, it has had a wonderful effect of now coming within and starting to seed the possibilities. Indeed, we are in the process right now of, especially in my roles as both the advocacy coordinator for LGBTQ plus people in the Methodist Oregon, Idaho Conference, but also within the Presbyterian Church, we are seeing such a change. There is a crack coming and is opening up. And that crack is hope, that crack is love, that crack that's opening up is peace. And I was reminded as Deborah was going through the timeline, I read this morning, 44 years ago, there was a gentleman who was openly gay on the floor of one of our General Assemblies of the Presbyterian Church. His name was David Sint. And he's since deceased, but he held up a sign 44 years ago on the floor of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, which is our national meeting ground, our revival tent. And he held up the sign, and the sign simply said, "Is anyone else out there gay?" Because he was the lone person at that place who was openly out and gay 44 years ago. So to see where we are today, with the youth expecting that our churches, that our synagogues, that our mosques, that our temples should be a place of haven, should be a place, and I use that word should, there is an oughtness to that, because in our religious traditions, all of them, we advocate love, we advocate safety, we advocate welcoming of the stranger. That's part and parcel, that's the cornerstone of our communities of faith, and that's why the young people, their inspiration, they're coming in, they're becoming religious leaders, is itself so important. You know, in this conference, in the Oregon, Idaho United Methodist Church Conference, we have 4, 5, 6, 7 out queer clergy, who, even though the rest of the denomination hasn't quite caught up, will get there. They are themselves brave and courageous people. In the Presbyterian Church, as you shared, I'm one of only a few people who are out, but it isn't a matter that more aren't out there. It's a matter of finding the jobs. And so slowly and surely, we are making progress. So in these glimmers of hope, that is shining a brighter light on the greater hope that is coming sooner rather than later.
That's great. Yes, absolutely.
I also want to say that I think the welcome and affirmation movements, which started in the 60s and 70s and 80s in a variety of religious traditions, are waking up to the fact that welcome, which is really the same as tolerance, is not enough. Right. And that what we really need to be creating, and what many of us are creating, is a place that celebrates everyone's unique contribution, everyone's unique connection with spirit, and everybody's unique teaching. In the Jewish tradition, we say each of us has our own Torah, and that Torah comes from the intersection of the experiences that we've had and the ways that we've chosen to become learned, and our proclivities and our instincts, right? It's all of those things. And of course, sexual orientation, identity, and gender identity are really primary ways that we understand the world. And so that adds to the unique Torah that we have to teach. So I think we're finally, just actually in the last 10 years, moving to that place of not just acceptance or tolerance, but celebration and invitation into leadership, an invitation into roles where others can be impacted by the beautiful stories that we have to share. So yes, I think it's very different now for young people.
That's great.
And again, given in the Protestant Catholic tradition, given Jesus as the one who is our role model, it is one of acceptance, it is one of grace, it is one of hope, it is one of accepting us as we are, who we are. In order to go back to the psalm that I read, because we were knit in our mother's womb by a God who knew exactly what God was doing.
That's lovely.
Amen.
Thank you. So, but to follow up on your point, Brett, many leaders in the religious community, your colleagues, are well-intentioned and kind and good people. And in my personal experience, people who were gay, or mostly gay men, were relegated to the choir space. And so, as you said, Deborah, they were welcome, but they were not fully a part. And so, what do you think still contributes to some of that that reluctance to let folks be more than, your choir director or, the donut organizer after service?
No, it's organist. At the recent gathering of the annual conference of the Oregon-Idaho United Methodist Church Conference in Boise, I had a chance to present myself there, and with the bishop's permission, I introduced myself as the queer eye for the Oregon-Idaho United Methodist Church Conference. And she said that was beautiful. She said, "You are exactly that." And one of the things that's beautiful, especially with the revamped, renewed version of this story of Queer Eye on Netflix, is there's a wonderful stage, there's a wonderful process that these people go through in going into a home and assessing where people are at. And so kind of what we're trying to figure out is, how did we get where we are? We didn't get here blindly. And how much of that was the contribution of American society and culture around us that kind of confuses us in terms of what is the call of the gospel. And so I think that what we are in the process of doing and inviting people to do is dig deep and to figure out what is of American culture, American society, that is still largely homophobic, give or take whatever goes on with the Supreme Court, and wherever you want to bake a wedding cake. We are struggling to give people, if you will, something that we don't always teach well, and that is courage. Because to be who you were created to be takes courage. And what people are needing are role models, both within our faith communities as well as outside of our faith communities. But we need people who provide a role model for how to live open, smart, honestly, lovingly, enjoying who they are and answering the call in religious leadership. Deb and I are part of a group of queer clergy who meet every month, and it's one of the most beautiful things. And we come from all faith communities, Buddhist as well as Jewish as well as Protestant and so forth and so on, is we are able to relate to each other about some of the wounds we have felt. It's only been around this community for 15 years. We just celebrated our being here, and we have seen such advances, but so much more, and it goes back to needing more role models. I know in the Protestant church, a lot of young, quote, girls at a certain age, and boys, but girls were suddenly seeing popping up here or there women in the role of being the preacher behind the pulpit. And they looked up and they said, I can do that. And that's what we're hoping to do and to provide in the United Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church, more people getting up behind the pulpit and being called to those positions so that other young LGBTQ kids who are out there will look up and say, I feel the call to do that as well and pursue that call. Mm-hmm. So that's how we break it through so that the LGBTQ person, largely gay men, aren't designated to be the organist and the choir director and break out of that trope.
Yeah. Do you think there's still, I've always wondered this too, is there those last sort of holdouts that are just refusing to let any LGBTQ people participate, or you can come but you don't get to say anything? Is that still that like biblical fear of hell, like you've made the wrong choice, you've gotten behind the wrong horse, and when Judgment Day comes, you're going to be judged? You know,
one of my colleagues at Duke University was Mickey Eford, who said if you read the Bible one way, you have to read it the whole darn way, that way. And so when I come and meet these people who are having the hardest time doing that, women and men alike, I keep on looking at their gold jewelry and saying, you know, in 1 Timothy, I think that there was a no-no about that kind of thing. I believe, you know, when people just pull out, cherry-pick certain verses, you kind of want to open them up to their understanding of how they're reading Scripture and the authority of Scripture in their lives and how they are self-selecting. Again, that's where I think there's a confusion between the American culture and that culture, which is the context of church, mosque, and synagogue.
Awesome. For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Carol Collymore, and I'm talking with Rabbi Deborah Kolodny and Reverend Brett Webb Mitchell about LGBTQ experiences in faith communities. And Deborah, do you want to take some more of that?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's really a split in the Jewish world between the Orthodox world, which is about 20% of American Jewry, and the remaining 80%. But the answer to the question of how do we get where we are, or from the place where people were either closeted or relegated to specific roles, to a place of expansive welcome and inclusion celebration. Jews are really, you know, we're the people of the book, so we're really into checking in on Scripture. And there's a lot of beautiful queering of the text is a typical phrase, but I think it's a bad phrase. I think it's correct reading of the text is emerging, right? So it's always been absolutely clear in the Jewish reading of the Hebrew Scriptures that God is neither male nor female, but both. And there's been philosophical treatises written on this. And the first being that was created in the image of God, B'Tselem Elohim, was both male and female. And the grammar of that sentence even says that first being, singular, was both male and female, plural. And that's what's in the image of God. So God is a plurality of maleness and femaleness, which basically means God is genderqueer. So for goodness sake, if God is genderqueer, how can you exclude anyone based on gender identity that doesn't conform to what your narrow understanding is of gender identity? So that's one example, right? So once you get there, it becomes rather easy on the human level to understand how we need to treat people with respect, if not inclusion. Celebration is the word I keep going to. There's also, I'm so glad you lifted up Psalm 139. I'm really fond of lifting up what practices support us in our expanding of welcome and celebration. In the Jewish liturgy, every single day, we start our services with a snippet that I'll sing it for you. Elohai neshama shenatata bi tehorahi my God, the soul you have created in me is completely pure. And it's not that some people get to sing that prayer and other people don't get to sing that prayer. Every single one of us gets to sing that prayer. Herein lies a different theology between Judaism and Christianity. We are born with a pure soul. We weren't born into original sin. And so everyone, however we were beautifully and thoughtfully and intentionally created, has a pure soul. So there's scripture that we can dive into. There's liturgical practice that we can dive into. And I think over time, actually, when you say things over and over, or you sing things over and over, you actually might start to believe them, especially if they're framed for you in a way that helps lift up this expansive and inclusive reading.
That is incredibly kind. Thank you. So switching gears a little bit, there are a lot of media narratives that pit religious communities against LGBT communities, and a lot of queer folks and trans folks have traumatic experience with organized religion. How do we start to try to address that, or is that already left the barn, or can we start to sort of repair that image of if you're LGBTQ, you're not at all involved in church, and religious people just hate you, and that's it. And they're going to vote in a different way.
So, unlike Deborah, I have gone to the clubs. And I think what we have done, many of us in the LGBTQ community, is we create community because we are starved for fellowship. We are starved for being with others. Not always, quote, like us, but people who are at least open, accepting, and welcoming. And so for many in the gay community, for example, and lesbian community, it happened to happen around bars because that was a place of welcome. That was a place where we could create community. And so that desire to continue to create that and that calling, Nadia Bowles-Faber, who's a Lutheran pastor, she said that she became a minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America because she was part of a stand-up group, and one of the stand-up comedians that was her church died, and everyone looked at her to be the minister. And so that's how she started. And so I think that we continued to create community, even though our communities of faith, if you will, de-churched us. They told us at our baptism, after our baptism or refusing our baptism, you are no longer welcoming here. Refusing to ordain us, that people finally went to other contexts to go ahead and fulfill the call. One person that I know was told by his annual conference, knowing that he was openly gay, they said, well, don't tell the Board of Ordained Ministry that you're gay, lie for Jesus. And he said, I couldn't do that, so what he has become, Dean, my partner, has become is he is the executive director of wellness and preventative initiatives. In other words, he's a sex, drug, alcohol educator on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill, in which he ministers to thousands of people and brings good stuff. And so I think we have found other places to do that. And now it's time for us to turn to the communities of faith from whence we have come and said, we have a place here, we have a calling here. Mm-hmm.
And how do you compel, if that's even a responsibility, of other folks of religious faith? We had talked earlier about evangelicals and the Mormon community, the Church of Latter-day Saints community, who actively organize against LGBTQ folks.
Yeah, can I jump in here? Yeah, first of all, I want to say that this conversation, God versus gay, has been going on for a long time. That's a book, by the way, by my friend Rabbi J. Michelson, God versus Gay. You should pick it up.
Amazon.com, I'm sure.
And what is dispiriting to me at times is how right-wing religious people seem to have captured the media attention as the voice of religion, not just on LGBTQ issues, but on a multitude of issues. And only now, it seemed like, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing, but when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, the voice of radical progressive religion somehow went into hibernation. And that doesn't mean that we were not still here, us leftist, radical, progressive, LGBTQ-loving faith leaders and faith communities. It just meant somehow the media directed its attention towards the right left-wing folks, the Family Foundation and the Freedom Foundation, and I guess if your name starts with an F, that's where you belong. But so this has never been true. This has never been the case. And what I see happening now is that not just what's happening within denominations, but in the world at large, radical progressive, left-wing faith leaders and faith communities are taking the stage, and we're taking the streets, and we're saying, no, you don't get to own this narrative. If at the Pride March a couple of weeks ago, there were thousands of people of faith marching, and 4 people with their silly signs saying we were going to go to hell. So, that's the story. There are thousands of people of faith saying, we're here, and some of us are queer, and the ones of us who aren't queer are committed to rewriting the narrative that religion is unwelcoming. And I guess I want to right now engage you into that story. So if you are not LGBTQ, and if you are a person of faith, I want to invite you to become part of the story that says religious communities and religious people welcome, honor, and celebrate LGBTQ people. That's all it takes. Come on board. You're welcome.
Right. One of the most beautiful things at the end of the annual conference for the Oregon-Idaho United Methodist Church Conference was also Boise Pride. And we welcomed and invited everyone during the annual conference to come and join us that we were going to be part of the Pride March. And 60 people had signed up to say, yes, we wanted to do it. On Saturday morning, 100 United Methodist Church folks came out of that annual conference and joined us and walked together with the banner of United Methodist Church. Not only that, but along with me, another gay clergy person, Izzy Alvaron, we were openly sharing, we had an open table, we were sharing bread and the cup, and we had so many people streaming forward to hear these words, this is the body of Christ, this is the cup of love. And the bishop herself, Bishop Elaine, came and joined us in the march itself. And so to see us doing this, as Deb said, seeing the cracks, seeing the welcoming, seeing people rising up and holding on and saying, this is our story, we invite you to tell your story and join the stories that we are all doing.
I want to add specifically, you asked about evangelical communities and about communities that are really, truly, deeply not welcoming and in fact are still angry, hostile, and wounding. Those certainly exist. And I have been doing interfaith work in this arena for 2 decades. And what I have learned is that as a Jew, I don't get airtime in evangelical churches, Actually, I think as a UCC minister, I wouldn't. Right. Each stream of religion needs to do its own work internally. So then the question becomes, how can I ally myself? How can I help resource those activists within those continually wounding communities? And the answer seems to be that just kind of being in partnership, being in friendship, being in giving social and spiritual and emotional support has been the best role that we could play. Because when outsiders come in, we harden the resistance to the leadership and the antagonism. And there's good news in the Mormon community. There are many activists who are pushing back. There are many activists who are pushing back. So
great. And so do you think we're coming to a space that's maybe we call it full circle, where your sexual orientation or identity is being pushed out of this political space instead of being pulled in? Because what I'm hearing is people accepting people on moral reasons, right, not political reasons. So is this a time and space where we're finally not politicizing LGBTQ life in a religious space?
I don't think that there can be I'd love to live in Oz just for a little while. I don't think that there can be a separation. The wall between church and society is fluid, it is porous, and so the politics of the state also happen to interfere with and influence what's going on within the context of faith communities. What we are bandying around today is separation between church and state. They influence each other in profound ways, and that's why it's important. Again, I look at Ireland as a case in point, in which, again, The laws regarding marriage equality and all in Ireland were very stern, strict. It was a Catholic country, and yet the people rose up and the people changed the Constitution. And the way they changed the Constitution, Dan Savage always likes to say, our secret weapon of choice is telling our stories. To come out, tell our stories, live our stories, be bold, sing our stories, dance our stories, but come out. The mother, the father, the son, the daughter, the cop, all the people started to come out. And that's what changed in Ireland. And I think that's what will continue to change and promote the change here in the United States, both within the context of faith communities as well as in the context of the city-state, is telling our stories, living our stories, and being sure that our stories are given the freshness, the fresh air to make that change. It's an evolution. We are making that change, and we just need to continue to do it. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint. So,
I want to actually say that while I have a few thoughts in response, that question was so deep and so thoughtful. So first of all, thank you for raising it. I haven't thought about it before. Really beautiful. So I have a few thoughts. They're just beginning thoughts. In the Jewish world, we have a premise called Dina Malchuta Dina, which means that we are obligated to abide by the laws of the land. So whatever our religious laws are, if they're not something we can control in our private sphere, we have to abide by the laws of the land. So the political still impacts the religion because of that premise. So if the law of the land is that same-sex couples can get married, individual rabbis can choose not to do it, but we have to honor that, just one example. On the other hand, there are still, I think, significant inroads to be made where there isn't yet clarity on the political sphere. Like, for example, whether or not we can have bathrooms where transgender people can go safely in public spaces. In some states, that's been handled. In other states, it hasn't. And so the question is, you can't rely on whatever has been figured out politically, and you still need to have the moral conversation. So I think there's a dance and an interplay, and I also want to be in a place where I don't want folks to be begrudgingly accepting because there's a law, so we're going to be okay. And there is still a moral discourse, and I think the place in all the faiths that I've seen where that moral discourse still needs the most work is around bisexuality and transgender identity. In the Jewish world, I will say that this born this way argument has led people intellectually to the place where, well, if you can choose who your partner is, then you do have a choice. So it renders the bisexual identity somehow outside of that born that way argument. Whether or not that's rational, that's where people go. And so I think morally, that's where we're still having some work to do, and I think it applies also to the transgender and genderqueer community. So I guess I want to just say we still have work to do, as good of a picture as we might be painting. Yeah.
Thank you for answering that. So for our radio audience, again, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Carol Collymore, and I'm talking with Rabbi Deborah Kolodny and Reverend Brett Webb Mitchell about LGBTQ experiences in faith communities. Now is the time we get to go to the audience for some questions. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, please hold it high for City Club staff to collect. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. To City Club members who would like to ask a question at the microphone, please identify yourself as a member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less. I can't see the microphone. Oh, there it is. Hello. Please go ahead.
Ted K., City Club member. The tolerance, acceptance, and welcoming you're describing appears most related to liberal and moderate denominations and primarily white. How do you see this issue today in religious denominations serving Black, Hispanic, and Asian communities? What's the situation for them today?
I was given the honor of teaching at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina for 5 years, teaching ethics and world religion. North Carolina Central University is over 100 years old as a historically black college university. The majority of my students were, of course, 99% of my classes were, students were black, 1% Hispanic. And so I always had joy the first day of ethics to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Dr. Brett Webb Mitchell. I'm a parent, I am a Presbyterian minister, and I'm gay. In which there was always this utter, did he say he was a parent? And so what I was always, what I instantly was aware of was those students of mine who were going to Pentecostal holiness churches, in which, in evangelical, Baptist, non-denominational churches, in which that was wholly new, to both say that I was gay and that I was a parent. And so part of what the course allowed me to do, I taught ethics, English, as well as world religion, was to go underneath the surface and try to figure out what was going on in their respective moral communities, and their moral communities happened to be the church, be it AME or African Methodist Episcopal or African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church or Church of God in Christ. And what I discovered was, what I've discovered in my own denomination, is telling the stories. I started the LGBTQ staff, faculty, administrative group for LGBTQ folks, and lo and behold, none of the black men who are gay would join our group. And they said, because we don't feel safe. And so what I'm aware of, and Deborah and I have already been talking about this, is and the reason I was so slow in coming out was I didn't feel safe. I knew there was a possibility when I came out of the closet of losing family, losing jobs, denied my call, no longer being able to teach within the seminary. So I knew that the cost was going to be steep in terms of vocation. And so I think that that's what has held back so many within more evangelical, in other churches that are historically black. But again, where we are finding, as we found in many of the more progressive liberal denominations, is telling our stories. Telling it, offering it, listening to it, and that tends, I know of nothing else, because, again, to go back to Jesus, the way that Jesus made a difference in the world was by relationships. It wasn't by programs. It wasn't by talkathons like this. It was by relationships of getting to know each person individually and giving them the space to feel safe. And so that's what I started to try to provide my students, faculty, staff, administrative colleagues, was a safe place to tell our stories. And I think that will continue to be the legacy, and that will continue to be the way that we change the world. As Deborah and I tell our stories feeling safe, but we invite others to tell their stories, we need to then be quiet and let others to tell.
And I just want to interject really quickly, because I think the assumption is that communities of color are more biased to LGBTQ communities. Can you just clear that up?
Sure. I would say that having just lived the last 25 years in North Carolina, prejudice happens across it knows no color. The hate knows no color. It knows no ethnicity, it knows no nationality. Hate is an equal employment opportunity provider, and exists across the board in all of our faith communities, and small and large alike. So thank you.
Colin?
So I'm conscious that you are both LGBT people moving in faith communities, but also people of faith moving in queer community. And as Carol mentioned earlier, right, a lot of queer folks have been harmed or traumatized, and that has created sort of sometimes a culture of antipathy toward organized religion. And so I'm wondering about your experiences. Do you ever feel like you're coming out as a person of faith in queer community? Do you feel like you're put in positions of having to defend your faith or defend your community in that way?
It happens all the time. And I'm never put in the position to defend. I'm just told that I'm ignorant, or how could such a smart person like you believe in this nonsense? And so, yeah, it happens all the time. And I actually think that one of the greatest calls for religious leaders right now is to address all forms of religious wounding. A lot of that religious wounding that response is from wounding, right? So as you said, so the response from me isn't to defend. My response is to inquire where with that person, so that we could have a conversation about wherever that wounding happened. And so the first thing I do is I join with them and I say, yeah, I get where your point of view comes from. So tell me your story. And I would never defend intellectually into a wound. That's absurd. That only reinforces the wound, right? So I pastor to that person. That's the job. That's the task. I pastor that to that person in the moment. Yeah, and I think that's what all of us do, right? What I want to say, it's not just around LGBTQ status. I mean, look at the Catholic Church. There's all kinds of religious wounding around sexuality from, the horrific child sexual abuse crisis, right? So there's incredible misogyny in a lot of faith traditions. So there's gender identity and sexual wounding that comes from religion in all spheres. So I don't want to limit this task just to the LGBTQ world.
And that's kind of dovetailed into this audience question. Can you comment on the lasting effects that the current more progressive Pope may or may not have in the U.S. or worldwide for LGBTQ Catholics?
Yeah, for us two non-Catholics, let's see what we have to say. Go, Brett.
And one Reformed announcer, yeah.
As I've been told by my Catholic colleagues and friends, is style matters, and that before there's a change in substance, there has to be a change in style. And so I think, as I keep on quickly reminding my sisters and brothers who are my Catholic friends, who point to something that the Pope was rumored to have said, I keep on saying to them when they say, well, there's great evidence of change in the church, I keep on saying, wake me up when women are ordained. Wake me up and let's see the change going on when married people are able to be ordained. Because in the pecking order of life, that out of the denominations and the religious communities we're talking about, again, in order to be ordained, even as a deacon in the Catholic Church, you can only be male and cisgender, so forth and so on. And so the doctrine and the dogma of the church has not changed one whit, and there is no evidence of there being any change in that. Until there is change in that, then we can go ahead and start to celebrate significance. But again, as my Catholic sisters and brothers have told me, the style is changing a bit. Give us time. And as I said, wake me up when the first woman's ordained.
All right, I'm in the back on the microphone.
Hi, Carol Witherell, City Club member. First, thank you all. It's been a very enlightening, wonderful dialogue you've created up there. My question comes from some ongoing work that I've been doing in justice system reform and racial justice issues. And the question is, are there resources for congregants of any faith community or citizens outside of any faith community to examine our own biases, implicit biases, and homophobic or racist views, because I find it's a lifelong adventure and commitment once one starts to do that, and it opens so many doors that are often more productive than the hate versus love, and yet that's the love doctrine to me is really important too. Thank you.
I'm not aware of religious sources that use, for example, the Harvard implicit bias test as the foundation for, which I think would be a great thing to happen, but there's endless resources that are generally movement-specific, denomination-specific. In the Jewish world, there's an organization called Keshet, which is devoted to educating on LGBTQ lives and uses scripture and sociology and community theory and psychology, so really addresses all of those forms. I don't know if they work at it through the implicit bias lens, which I think is a great lens. The UUs have put out reams of training materials for their congregations to work from. There's an organization called the Religious Institute, which has also put out lots of educational materials. So the Religious Institute is one trans-denominational ecumenical organization. So I don't know if the very specific question you asked has an answer out there right now, but my guess is there's lots of resources that come very close to what you're looking for.
The reason I wrote the one book on being a gay parent was because Dan Savage had just come out with his book, and he, because of the wound that he felt from his being raised as a Catholic was so deep, he was kind of angry at the church in the book. That's why I wrote a book that was pro-gay, pro-faith, pro-family. I think in the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches, as well as the specific denominations within the Protestant Church, there have been quite a few, and there are quite a few good resources out there.
That's wonderful. Okay, I think we have time for one last question, very quickly. Is the Oregon LGBTQ community rethinking some of its early rejection of early trans Oregonians, such as Dr. L. Hart of Albany? Or we can just generalize it to the early rejection of trans, and you touched on it a little bit earlier.
Yeah, but this is speaking about the LGBTQ community, not the religious community.
Right.
I got here 7 years ago, and so I'm frankly not aware of that history. And since I have been here, I have seen no exclusion, judgment. I've only seen extravagant welcome, inclusion, appreciation, celebration. So I don't have the data. I don't know. I'm sorry.
No, I preached a few weeks ago at Bridgeport UCC, United Church of Christ, and one of the most beautiful things that happened was being introduced in my role both within the United Methodist Church as well as a Presbyterian clergy person. And what that gave permission for, and there was a wonderful standing ovation because many of these people are women who were, and some who were trans, male to female, who never thought that they would hear that someone was ever employed being open and in these positions. And again, part of the hurt and part of the ache has been feeling that neither in society nor in the context of a faith community has there been a welcome. And so again, what Deb and I do, a lot of our work is working with those who have been de-churched, de-synagogued, de-templed, de-mosqued, who have felt that there has been this breach. And yet there is this deeper call within of wanting to be part of a faith community.
Right.
Yeah.
Brett.
And to use the words, repair the breach.
Right. Brett and Deborah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, our time is up for the day. Please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you all for coming. I hope this is the start of many conversations. We're adjourned.